In my lifetime of being in this area, this is probably the 15th or 20th time this piece of ground's been burned.
We're in the Highlands at the beginning of May and Niall Rowntree is letting off steam.
Some of the things that deer managers can't control are the likes of what's just appearing behind us.
Now you may ask what this has to do with Highland sport. Well, quite a bit actually, as coming down the line is the Jacobite steam engine. Scotland's West Coast Railways line, historically famous for transporting stalkers to the hill, is now better known for transporting Harry Potter to Hogwarts. But there is a problem. This wonderful symbol of national heritage is destroying another.
Right, where we are here, David, we're on the top of the Ardnamurchan Peninsula. This is in West Inverness. What we've done here is worked hard to reduce deer densities to a level that permits regeneration and permits a lot of the restoration of habitats that currently tick all the boxes for government. In the past, there was funding in place for controlled burning on the railway sides, particularly on steeper slopes where the engine was working hard pulling the carriages, so that fires couldn't get out of control because there was minimal fuel load. Whereas if you look around behind you here now, up on this slope above you, that's been burned to a crisp last year. Within a mile there's been another big fire. And all the way along this stretch of the line, valuable, fragile habitats are being burned on an annual basis. And nobody really seems to want to either care or do anything about it.
Stop doing that way.
To my mind, it strikes me as incredible that in their deer plans, they aren't taking this into account. There has to be some kind of mitigation for them, that if landowners have done their very best, and other activities neighbouring their land cause the vegetation to be burned, they can't be held responsible for it.
So the deer managers reduce deer numbers to save habitat. The protected habitat is destroyed by wildfires started by a steam engine. This is ignored by government, which looks at the scorched earth and tells deer managers to shoot more deer. Back on Ardnamurchan, and the deer in his park are still getting supplementary feeding. It's 2018 and this last winter has been the worst for a generation.
It started raining in June last year and forgot to stop. It's not just been a bad winter for deer, it's been a bad winter for sheep, and people have had to work hard to keep feeding going for the cattle as well. And these are maybe one of the things for climate change that we're just going to have to be aware of, is that as the climate gets wetter, we're going to have more challenging winters. The hill deer, we stopped feeding them about 2 weeks ago. But with the Pear David and that in the park here, we keep the feeding going on as the grass is away in the early part of May. It's been a slow late spring. So we basically monitor them for consumption, and if they're still coming and taking it, we'll keep it going. So probably another 2 to 3 weeks of this, and then it'll slowly fade out. So we've gone from feeding every day now to every other day, and then we'll slowly fade it out. So by the end of this month, the feeding in the park will be over too. But the mineral tubs will stay out for them right the way through until they finish growing antler.
Niall has some advice for anyone feeding deer.
The main do's and don'ts is, if you're going to feed them something that it's worth feeding them. Don't feed them something that makes you feel good and doesn't do them a lot of good. People will feed them a lot of things like, there's a lot of people feed them tatties, and I'm not a great believer in feeding tatties to deer because they don't have a lot of value in them. They're just bulking the animal and not giving them a lot of benefit. And the other thing I would say about feeding deer, if you can avoid feeding them on the ground in the same place, avoid feeding them on the ground in the same place, because what you'll get is you'll get quite a build-up of parasites, particularly when a lot of deer are congregating in an area, and you can very quickly increase parasite burdens, particularly worms. So it's an error to keep feeding them on dirty black ground. So we make the point of feeding them up off the ground where we can. The other thing is to make sure if you're feeding a lot of deer, give them at least 80% of their daily requirement. And then it's worth the investment of their time and energy to be there. There's nothing worse than keeping deer in a place and not feeding them enough. And then the other thing is looking at the weather and the conditions and the condition of your deer. If you've got it in your head that you've only got enough feeding to keep them going till the end of February, beginning of March, and March and April are particularly bad, then don't be shocked if you go back to a feeding area and find deer lying dead. Because if they've become habitualised to feeding in that spot, then you've got to keep it going. And two things I would say about feeding them. Feeding shouldn't be used as an excuse for overpopulation. Feeding should be used to enhance the performance of or to divert deer away from places. I wouldn't support it as an action just to keep higher numbers alive.
May is not a time for shooting deer, so Niall's Blaser R8 only comes out for foxing or for dealing with marauders.
What are you doing here, boys? What we're doing now is a great example of modern kind of kit, modern technology on the go. So this thing, tack drivingly accurate with a Leica scope on it. But we've now got to the time of day we want to do something else. So now switching to the Pulsar thermal sight. And again with the Blaser, because it's also a modular stuff, it's so much easier to do. Just a couple of quick turns of the lever. And that's that thing now ready to go again. So we'll put the magazine in the bottom, a couple of rounds in it, just to double check before we do it, weapons clear. And we can take this, pop in the box out the road, lift the spotter out.
You've been enjoying your thermal kit?
I must be honest, I mean, the more I use it, and the more I speak to colleagues that use it, the more I think that there's a couple of things that I think for what we're doing, it is absolutely a game changer. I mean, you don't disturb wildlife half the way you do with a spotlight. And a lot of our foxes, I mean, we don't have a big fox population, so I mean, a lot of our foxes are quite shy to get to grips with. And we've gone from having foxes you couldn't get a hold of because they were lamp shy. This year, the dens, we've had 100% success on everything. So I'm highly impressed with it. It seems like a lot of money, but I think if you do have foxes you need to control and you want to monitor, I mean, as much as culling stuff for the site, the spotter, just to see what's going on, I think modern deer stalkers and gamekeepers, it's an invaluable piece of kit. I think within a few years it'll be as commonplace for you to have it and use it as it was 50, 60 years ago for people to start using binoculars.
May is also a time for new life. The sheep on the crofts are starting to lamb, but they're vulnerable, not to foxes, Niall's taken care of those, but sea eagles. Many still deny that the enormous raptor introduced to this part of Scotland takes the newborns. The crofters and Niall no different. This is rewilding for real. It's messy and there's conflict. One way of dealing with it is this, a big orange, terrifying, flappy inflatable designed to send the apex predator away, possibly to think hard about what it's done.
There you go.
It's difficult not to find it all a bit comical.
That's it.
Niall, what is happening?
That's the angry man.
He looks like a drunk man, not an angry man.
Well, the wind's pushing that one over, but that's the idea, is it leaps up and there's a whistling noise. Listen. That's it.
That was it?
That was it.
And that will have done what?
Well, the idea is that if the sea eagle is in the area hunting the lambs, that the angry man popping up, whistling and waving his arms around will be enough to deter the eagle from hunting the lambs on the bank. To me, it generates a whole host of questions, David, because I mean, we've known for a long time that, well, certainly for the last 10 years, that the amount of impact of sea eagles on lambs here has been steadily increasing. We're also aware that the sea eagle population itself is steadily increasing. And there's been a very long debate that sea eagles don't take perfectly healthy, viable lambs. But I think for the majority of people, other than the environmental evangelists, the fact isn't really challenged now. So the idea is that products like that will reduce the impact on lambs by disturbing hunting birds away from lambing areas. I hadn't really seen this device in use before, but it's in a couple of places on the peninsula this year. And we're just getting into the key time now for lambs being predated on by the eagles. So let's watch and see what happens. I think a decent gale of wind, if he rises up at the wrong moment, he might end up in Malig.
Angry man flying?
You might end up with an absent man rather than an angry man.
Do you think that's then acknowledging an issue?
I think yes. The field staff that work here with the sea eagles are pretty level-headed people. They're working within the confines of law. I think that they're doing their best, but I have never had a conversation with them in which they've said to me that eagles don't take lambs. I think it's about how they manage the issue. So whether angry men are going to be commonplace or other things are going to take a hand, who knows?
One word of caution, if you Google inflatable angry man, you won't get the result you expect. To complete this trip to Ardnamurchan, Niall asks ecologist Dr Cathy Mayne to show us the work, as required by government, that she's carrying out on the estate to monitor grazing impact.
From my perspective, the habitat is the foundation on which everything else depends for its nutrition, its capacity to survive. And if that is incapable of doing the job, or it is being used in a way which is not sustainable in the long term, then that's bad news for the future. So look at the habitat first, and that then determines what level of herbivore impacts can be tolerated. And deer will tend to take these. The sheep don't like them, but they do take the foliage, which the deer tend to avoid. This area will tolerate a higher level because there is better bedrock, there is better nutrition in the soil, and it grows better biodiversity, if you like. In places which have a very acidic bedrock, you wouldn't get the same diversity of plants, you wouldn't get the same amount of green stuff for herbivores to eat. Interrupted by my assistant, as ever.
Niall's also told us that she's no tree hugger.
Yes, I confess I enjoy hunting. I feel very respectful about taking a life. But I have learned to do it because I understand the need for culling. I understand the need for a population that is capable of decimating the habitat it lives on without careful management, having lost its predators. And if I think that needs to be done, I need to be willing to do it myself. And in the process of learning what that means, I've actually discovered that there's a kind of primeval bit of me that quite enjoys trying to get into the head of a deer. You know, where will the deer be today? What will they be doing? And that's a very basic part of human makeup, which I think a lot of people aren't in touch with anymore. And it allows you to move through a landscape and enjoy a landscape in a very different way as well. I've always walked the hills, I've climbed, but I've never moved through the landscape as if I were a hunter, as if I were looking for dinner. And that's a very different view. And I like it, I must admit, yeah. My job here today is to put in some permanent sample plots for habitat impact assessment so we can look at the impacts that we've got and how they will change through time. And then we'll come back to the same place next year, the year after, and repeat that survey and see how that's changed. And in this location, it might have changed quite a lot. The sustainable rural economy, is it about deer? Is it about agriculture? Is it about forestry? Is it about ecotourism? It's about all of those things, and in a lot of places there's conflict between the objectives of all of those. So whatever the broad policy of Scottish Government is, which is to secure the land in a good condition for its people, as I understand it, how that's delivered on the ground is always more complex than any broad sweeping policy can identify.
Springtime is a time of birth and death. April is the cruelest month, said the poet T.S. Eliot. Next time we join Niall in the summer when he can start getting the best out of the spring survivors, dealing with marauders and terriers.